and CEO of the
Coalition. Say that again.
I have staff who are like trained to interrupt me during key periods of my talking. No, my name is Joe Luke. That's okay, Karen. I'm president and CEO of the Coalition for Clean Air. And as you were just warned, this is going to be a recorded event. So don't say or do anything you don't want the whole world to see. Coalition for Clean Air, we spend every day protecting public health, improving air quality, and preventing climate change. And some evenings too. So this is one of those evenings. Thank all of you for joining. If anyone is feeling particularly charitable because of the giving season, please donate at least $19.71 to Coalition for Clean Air, because we're celebrating our founding in 1971, 50 years ago. And Brian or Karen will put the link to donating in the chat box for you. Today, we're here to talk about greening the supply chain, part 2. We did an earlier one. This one's focusing on Ventura County. And let me review a few housekeeping items, and then we're going to watch a short video about CCA, and then hear from our panelists and moderator before we turn it over to Chris Chavez, our Deputy Policy Director, to talk about some of our accomplishment goals and priorities. And then there should be some time during the panel session too to ask some questions. So just post those in the chat box. We'll get to the ones we can. And the whole thing should be over by 6 o'clock if we're on time, which will be nice, but you know, it'll go by real quick. In terms of housekeeping, we find it better if you use the speaker view, top right-hand corner. If you're on a joining via a Zoom app, should be up the top right-hand corner. Speaker view normally works better once things get going in the panel session and all of that. So you're seeing the person talking. You do have the opportunity to unmute your mic because we use the meeting format instead of the webinar format, which allows everyone to post in the chat and make private comments. But if you're not talking, please mute yourself because it interrupts others. We have the capability to mute you if we have to, but we prefer that you do it and not us. But speaking of the chat box, you can use it. Please use it. We encourage you to use it. Say hi to each other, talk to each other, send in your comments, your impressions, your concerns, anything you have in the chat box. Just go ahead and use that. It's a good way of letting people know what's going on. I did say we are, for those people just joining right now, we are recording this so that we can share it with others in the future. So again, please don't say or do anything you don't want the whole world to see. We would, Coalition for Clean Air, like to thank the sponsor of tonight's Clean Air Conversation, the Port of Hueneme of Southern California. We really do look forward to these events, and they're made possible through that sponsorship, those sponsorship opportunities, which Brian's happy to tell you about. But now a few slides about Coalition for Clean Air, if we're ready, Karen.
Yep.
When the Coalition for Clean Air was founded in 1971, Californians breathed some of the smoggiest air in the world. So we got to work. We led the charge for California's smog check program for passenger vehicles, a program that reduces 100 tons of automobile pollution every day. We cleaned up school buses so that kids don't get sick. We got the toxic chemical perc out of dry cleaning. And in 2019, we followed up with SB 210, a similar smog check program for heavy duty freight, which will result in emissions reductions equivalent to taking hundreds of thousands of trucks off California roads. But we're not resting on our laurels. With your help, we're fighting to eliminate diesel use in California, to bring millions of Californians together to clear the air each California Clean Air Day, to decarbonize our economy and meet our climate goals, and to deliver healthy air to all Californians in the next decade.
Thank you, Karen, for that. I see we're joined by a couple of close friends of Coalition for Clean Air, Senator Fran Pavley, who actually was panelist on our last Clean Air conversation just last week, and Glenn Dake, a longtime supporter of Coalition for Clean Air. Good to see you guys out there. Now for our panelists and moderator. Our panelists include Giles Pettifor, Environmental Manager of Port of Hueneme, and Andrew Pryor, the Senior Manager of Safety, Quality, and Sustainability at Wallenius Wilhelmsen, and a great panel with lots of expertise on port and freight issues in Ventura and Port of Hueneme. And our moderator will be none other than Dr. Laki Tisopoulos, an old friend of mine who I've known for a very long time, who is currently executive officer at the Ventura County Air Pollution Control District, but I know him much better as a deputy executive officer at South Coast Air Quality Management District for many, many, many years. So I'll turn it over to you, Laki.
Great. Thank you, Joe. Good evening, everyone. And thank you, Joe, for the introduction and the kind words. And thank you to the Coalition of Clean Air for spearheading this conversation on greening the supply chain in Ventura County. It's a very appropriate and timely topic for us to discuss. As we all know, goods transport, goods movement is a very significant sector of our economy, both local economy as well as regional economy, providing us with jobs, but along with the positive attributes that goods movement have, it's also associated with some environmental impacts that we'd like to avoid. And just to give you an idea, at the APCD, we are in the process of updating our air quality management plan. And as we sharpen up our pencil to figure out our refined inventories, we are finding out that ocean-going vessels, and I'm not talking about just the vessels that are docking at our local port in Port of Hueneme, but also including those that they are traversing across our waters, across our coast. They contribute approximately to 40% of our NOx emissions inventory, NOx, which stands for short for oxides of nitrogen. And if you add to this the tracking-related emissions associated with the goods movement, the number grows even bigger. So, and the same thing holds true with respect to the greenhouse emissions. Many of those transport corridors cut across our communities. Many of our communities are low income, overburdened, environmental justice communities. And as we all know, the Ventura County is a serious non-attainment area. So we have vested interest to see to it that the emissions impact, the emission signature from these activities comes down as quickly as possible, while we are still maintaining a viable economic environment for these type of activities and these companies to prosper, because they are such a source of jobs that we want to maintain. So we are very fortunate today to have two excellent panelists, Giles Pettifor and Andrew Pryor, representing two of our entities intimately involved with the goods movement activities, namely Giles is representing the Port of Hueneme, while Andrew is representing Wallenius Wilhelmsen. And there are two entities. They are very proactively attempting to address the issues that I try to articulate. And I had the pleasure to work with them for quite some time now. And I was hoping with the discussion, with the conversation today, will present to our audience and viewers what is being done currently and what we can expect moving forward, and the engagement and the technology, the engagement of the community. So we'll try to cover all aspects of that engagement. So with that, I'm going to open the conversation by asking you guys, could you share with us and with our audience, what are some of the key priorities, key initiatives that you are in the process of undertaking that will contribute to the greening of the supply chain? And perhaps I can start with you, Giles, and then I'll have the same question to you, Andrew, if you don't mind.
Great. Well, thank you, Dr. Tisopoulos. Thanks very much. I appreciate being given this opportunity by Joe and Brian and the team, Coalition for Clean Air. They've been a great partner to the port the last couple of years and working on some clean air awareness in the community and programs related to encouraging local citizens to be empowered to take individual actions and contribute to kind of the power of individuals contributing to greater change. So for the port's perspective, a little bit of background, I'm the environmental manager for the port. Port of Hueneme. We are the only deep water commercial seaport between the ports of Los Angeles and the port of San Francisco. We share space very, very closely with Naval Base Ventura County. So we operate on a very small slice of land surface that is adjacent to the naval base there. And we specialize in a small sort of set of niche cargoes, that being fresh produce, mainly bananas, and then automobiles. So the vessels that come into our port are typically of two flavors. They are small container vessels that are roughly when you're sitting on a beach or you're walking along the coastline in California and you look offshore, those extremely large container vessels that you can see from miles and miles away, those are typically en route to the large container ports. Of course, the ports of Los Angeles and Long Beach that are adjacent to our south, largest container ports in the country. Those two ports alone move more than 40% of all containerized goods coming into the US. They are mammoth. I mean, they're just huge, huge facilities in comparison to, say, a Hueneme. Hueneme is about 120 acres. And we are limited in the size of ships that can come into our port. So typically our largest ship is the max is around 800 feet, whereas most of those giant container ships are well over 2,000 feet frequently. We also bring in auto carriers, which is like a kind of a floating parking garage, if you will. And that brings in things like automobiles, but it also brings in pieces of heavy duty equipment. It also brings a lot of unusually sized pieces of equipment, things like piping sections for sewage plants or wind turbine blades, or elements of transformers or electrical infrastructure, just things that are large and heavy. So that's the types of cargo that we specialize in. The port has been around for almost 83 years. And in that time, its sort of, I guess, role in the Ventura County economy has grown over time. As Dr. Tisopoulos alluded to, we have to remember that the port is a piece within a much larger supply chain. It is simply sort of a node, if you will, a connection point that connects all of the country into this large global supply chain. And what is happening right now, and part of what I want to speak about this evening, is really how rapidly this entire system is changing. And that means globally as well as locally. And what is happening at Hueneme is indicative of this change that is taking place globally. And most of this change is being driven by one thing, and that is recognition of the climate crisis that is affecting the entire globe. That cannot be avoided. The conversation around those impacts cannot be avoided. Ventura County is seeing impacts faster than anywhere else in the country. You know, we've seen a faster rise in temperatures. We had the Thomas Fire, which was the largest sort of mega fire, if you will, that was largely climate change driven. We are seeing unprecedented levels of impact, and questions related to localized ways to reduce those impacts are very timely. But those conversations are not just happening alone here in our region. And it's something that Andrew will speak to certainly, but the role of the port as being this node within this chain makes us remember that what is happening at Hueneme and what is happening with these global partners is indicative of a system that has been built globally around basically consumption, manufacturing of goods and consumption of products. We have to remember that within the United States, greater than 70% of our GDP is based on consumption of goods. That is a huge, huge portion of economic activity all across the country from coast to coast. And of that 70% of goods, greater than 90% of that comes into the US on a containerized vessel. It then gets put onto a truck or a train and gets moved throughout the country. That whole process of getting you stuff has historically been structured really around some stuff that we'll get into tonight. And that is all changing. For the port, for our role in this, and what I want to highlight for that question from Laki is really this desire to be able to essentially continue to provide the economic services that the port plays. You know, we provide employment to a significant chunk of the Ventura County population. Greater than 15,000 people have jobs because of port cargo in our area. But more importantly, about taking responsibility for the pollution that the port has historically and does currently produce in that supply chain, about bringing in these new zero emission technologies and green energy fuels and opportunities. But it's also really critical to link all of that new technology and these new opportunities for types of equipment or fuels, et cetera, really bringing that connection straight into the community. Talking about the opportunity to take a kid who's in elementary school and show them a piece of zero emission equipment that runs on a battery, electric battery, or perhaps in the future, a hydrogen fuel cell that might power it with green hydrogen. That is something that is invaluable to sharing that message, that opportunity for STEM students from elementary school all the way up into our local colleges, universities, trade schools, et cetera, and getting that message out that all of us can play a role in this clean energy future, and that all of us can get our hands on that stuff and see it and experience it through a place like the Port of Hueneme. And we want to be a catalyst for Ventura County to not only drive, transition, if you will, from fossil fuel-based fuels to zero emission and decarbonized fuels, but really be a catalyst for bringing in resources into the community to help that change be driven out, sort of like, roots of a tree into the community to really bring that benefit to everybody.
Got it. Very good. Very enlightening. Andrew, would you mind telling us what your initiatives and priorities are currently?
Yes, sir. Yeah, so, starting with the broadest overview, Wallenius Wilhelmsen is a global shipping company. We ship a lot of things with wheels on them on ro-ro ships, and it's, vehicles and equipment all throughout. And for the purposes of this conversation, we have 3 different facilities within the Ventura County area, along with our ships that also dock there too. We have the Port Hueneme terminal, we have our Oxnard facility, and we have a facility in Santa Paula as well for processing equipment. And Wallenius Wilhelmsen, what we're doing is we're trying to be one of the leaders in sustainable shipping and logistics throughout the world. And there's 2 big precedents that we're working on right now that will really help when it comes to cleaning Ventura County. The first is from the ship side. So on the ship side, we're prepping all of our ships to be able to be powered by shore power whenever they arrive at berth. So instead of burning bunker fuel while they're at berth and producing emissions, we would then theoretically plug them into the ship side on the shore power. When it comes into the Port of Hueneme, that would be scope 2 emissions through SoCal Edison, and it would help to lower the amount of emissions that we would have while running inside of the port. And then from the land-based side, we have 86 facilities around the world, with those 3 right there in Ventura County. One of the things that I'm personally working on is transferring equipment from scope 1 burning fuel, petrol, diesel, propane, whatever it could be, to clean emissions burning equipment that helps in the process of loading and unloading these ships. So right now we have some very ambitious targets where within the next couple of years, we're actually going to be transferring all of our equipment over at the end of its life cycle to either hydrogen or electric forklifts, tug masters, vans, all of our equipment that helps facilitate the unloading and loading of these operations within the ports.
That's fascinating. And from both of your vantage points, could you share with us, again, from your viewpoint, some of the hurdles that you're facing in achieving this fine balance of economic and environmental goals? Because we don't want to bifurcate or divorce us two together. If we want to be smart about it and have a sustainable environment, it has to be accompanied by a sustainable economy and vice versa. So I'm sure you mentioned about plugging into shore power, switching to hydrogen, or perhaps electric battery for loading and unloading equipment. There's got to be some hurdles. Could you share with us what some of those hurdles are?
Andrew, I can start with that one if you want.
Sure. Yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah, that's a very timely question. And the reality is that, you know, with this transition that we're talking about, this global transition, again, local transition that we're enabling as well, it's really structured around exactly what Andrew mentioned, switching from fossil fuels to decarbonized fuels. Because we have to remember that when you look at fossil fuels, what we're talking about is really two separate issues that are inevitably linked and both critically important. And when you combust fossil fuels, you produce byproducts, especially when that combustion is, let's say, inefficient. So if you have an older piece of equipment, if you have a piece of equipment that isn't at the right temperature, if it's working in the right, or excuse me, not in the correct atmosphere, it produces byproducts. And those byproducts come in sort of two flavors. And those are greenhouse gases and criteria pollutants. And criteria pollutants would be things like little tiny particles of soot, particles that travel out away from the engine and produce pollution. A lot of the focus globally has been really focused on that question of GHG and climate change, because of course we have to remember atmospheric carbon dioxide levels are driven by exhaust, byproducts of that fossil fuel combustion. Also methane production, which is a major source of some of these types of fuels, not just bunker fuel or gasoline or kerosene, but things like natural gas, which can be converted into fuels like LNG or something called CNG, clean natural gas, or even propane. These are all fossil fuels that come through the same system of production. And so the significant leakage from that production system that is emitting methane into the atmosphere is a very critical part of this process, part of this concern related to fossil fuel consumption. And we have to remember that methane is incredibly more efficient at insulating the planet than carbon dioxide is. It's just shorter lived. So it does have sort of a date by which it disappears and decomposes, if you will, but it's a much more efficient blanketing of the planet. So it is critical to address methane emissions. And for that reason, concern around continuing usage of fossil fuels is very, very present and of very great interest for us as we look at future fuels. Because we have to remember that what we're talking about here, it's not just thinking about, well, we're going to take some piece of equipment and we're going to just put a different fuel in it. We have to remember that aside from the equipment, we also have to remember this fuel question, because the fuel section, that fuel question is critical to this question of challenges and hurdles. What we are talking about is infrastructure. We are talking about basically completely transitioning to brand new methodologies of fueling, be it hydrogen, be it battery electric, be it some unknown future fuel, maybe ammonia, maybe some types of biofuels, another one of these rapidly evolving sort of worlds of research these days. But that infrastructure is very, very expensive, because what you are doing is you're basically digging holes in the ground and putting in fuel tanks. You are trenching and putting in electrical wires and fueling pathways. You're putting in switch gears and batteries and plugs and wires and conduit. all of this stuff that requires tremendous, investment in digging up, buying, putting in the ground, but it's also really expensive to do that in most places. Putting in construction stuff, building stuff is expensive, especially in California. So for us as a owner of land and a user of fuels and a facilitator of fuel use, we want to do this very correctly, because the last thing that we want to do is dig up the ground and put something in and then 3 years later have to move that piece of equipment. So for us, it's getting the resources to basically provide all of this new infrastructure, but it's also the reality that a lot of the infrastructure and a lot of the equipment is just simply not available just yet. That commercially available pieces of heavy duty equipment, it's come a tremendously long way in the last 5 years, but there's still many pieces in that supply chain puzzle that you literally cannot buy even if you have the money. So that is a real concern. But I want to jump back just quickly to the other question I raised at the beginning of those two types of pollution problems. We talked about the GHG one, but we didn't really talk about the criteria pollutant one. And that criteria pollutant one is really critical because for a lot of frontline communities, that criteria pollutant of greatest concern is particulate matter. And in particular, it's diesel particulate matter, which is a tiny, tiny, tiny byproduct of combustion combined with a bunch of gases. And it has the ability to travel throughout the tissues and systems and organs of the body, cross the placental barrier, and pose a significant, sort of catalyst to bad health outcomes. That is a really, really present immediate concern that is driven by chronic exposure to DPM. Getting awareness around those exposures and finding actual information about that kind of exposure information is something that we see as a critical piece of this conversation. So for the port, we have been partnering with VCAP-CDE to try and basically do an assessment of the emissions that come from the port and work on a climate action plan that will not only address that GHG emission, but will very strongly focus on that diesel particulate matter emission piece. And what we also want to do is raise the awareness in the community about where they can get information about their own air quality, both from the air district and then from a monitor that we put up adjacent to the port that's specifically measuring combustion byproducts from things like trucks and ships, et cetera. So a bit of a long-winded answer there, Laki, I apologize, but that's a quick overview of some of those challenges.
Got it. And I truly appreciate that your open-mindedness and proactive collaboration with the APCD in developing your plan and tackling some of those emission sources and pollutants head on. My head is off to you guys because you mentioned about the diesel. It is something that needs to be addressed. It is a carcinogen. And we have made great progress as a state in reducing emissions, diesel exposure across the board. But the work is not done yet. We need to keep pushing that frontier up until diesel gets eradicated, from our skies. So let me turn around. Andrew, perhaps Giles touched upon some of your issues as well, but what else would you like to add?
Yeah, just going back to what Giles said, the largest issue that we're having a hurdle with when coming to some of these clean air goals is being able to find the equipment that suits the needs to be able to have carbon-free equipment. Some of it is out there. If I need to replace a 7,000-pound forklift, that's easy. Everyone makes it. But when I need to replace a 40,000-pound forklift or a 35-ton forklift within the Port of Hueneme, no one is making those yet. They're not out there yet. I think I know of 2 manufacturers who are making those yet. So one of the things that we're struggling with is for the manufacturers of the equipment that we're looking to have no emissions is for them to produce some of the larger equipment or for them to produce it at scale. On the same note, you look at Ford. I need to replace cargo vans. Cargo vans are one of the key elements in what we do within all of our facilities because we use them to transport people. The only person right now making a clean cargo van is Ford, and they're not taking orders on their vans until model year 2023. So for us, the biggest challenge is for the OEMs and the equipment providers to have the sustainable equipment that we need that fits the needs of what happens within the port environments.
Got it. Got it. Got it. Very good. Very good. I was wondering if you can clarify for me, both Giles and Andrew, when we read the press, the LA Times, and we look towards the horizon, we see those ships, those vessels lined up, they go for miles and miles. So that queuing aspect not only bottlenecks the goods distribution, but it does have an environmental implication, emissions implication that the local community is not happy about it at all. Now, we have not seen the same type of queuing here in Port of Hueneme. It's a much smaller port, so we need to be a lot more efficient in going in and out of the port. But just for our audience, could you clarify for us, is this a problem here in Ventura, or is it mostly an LA/Long Beach problem?
Andrew, you want to jump in on this one first, or how are you feeling about it?
So I can answer from the Wallenius perspective first, and I'll let you answer from Hueneme as a whole. So if you look at the global supply chain and what's happening at the Port of LA, Port of Long Beach, these other ports around the world, when it comes to this queuing problem, a lot of that queuing problem is really just the container vessels, and then the other pieces of the supply chain that have to happen when those container vessels pull in. We are not seeing that issue with the RoRo, roll-on, roll-off vessels. Actually, with the RoRo vessels, what's happening is the inverse. Because of the global microchip shortage, cars are in very high demand, and they're not being produced at the level that they were produced pre-pandemic levels. So what's happening is actually the RoRo ships are passing these queues of the container ships, going straight into the berth, being directly unloaded, and then going straight to the dealerships for them to already be sold. And just a key example, our facility in Los Angeles usually holds around 220 Nissans and Mazdas per year. And this year we're seeing roughly about a 40% reduction in volume because of the pandemic. But instead of having as much inventory as we've previously had in years, almost all inventory that's coming in is already sold, waiting on a customer, ready to go, and ships out immediately. So from our perspective with the RoRo ships, no, we're not in queue. We're going straight in, unloading, and straight out. Great.
Great. Giles, you agree?
Yeah, absolutely. And this partly goes back to why we don't have the queuing in Hueneme. It goes back to something I was alluding to at the beginning with those two kind of cargoes. As Andrew indicated, yeah, the RoRo stuff is, you know, when cars do come into the port, typically 4 out of every 5 roughly are pre-sold. Some of our OEMs can actually sell sell cars while they're in transit because there's such high demand right now. The other interesting sort of facet associated with that and greening of the supply chain, the percent of zero emission battery electric or plug-in hybrid vehicles that we're seeing moving through the port is growing. I'm not going to say exponentially because that's kind of a misused phrase, but it's growing very strongly, let's just say. It certainly seems as though the sort of critical peak of interest in those types of vehicles has really exploded. I'm particularly excited to see what happens once the Ford F-150, the electric version of that, comes out next year. I think that's going to be a bit of a watershed moment for electric vehicles in particular. But I want to get back to your question. Related to the RoRos, obviously they just come in and come out very efficiently. The container ships that come into Hueneme, as I said, are mainly moving produce. So they typically can't sit too long because you do not want that produce to spoil. It's a pretty critical part of the supply chain. But again, because we are so small on the waterfront, prior to this supply chain sort of bottleneck issue, we just don't have the luxury of allowing cargo to build up on port and run our model of sort of throughput with that being a part of it. The only way that we are able to succeed is to be efficient and effective in basically bringing cargo in and moving it out very quickly. So that hasn't changed, and that has allowed us to basically prevent any kind of queuing from occurring. But it's also very intentional on our part. You know, our management has really looked to structure the way that business moves at the port to keep the open, 24 hours a day, such that stuff can continue to come and go. But then additionally, they really want to avoid that queuing issue. And the queuing, we have to remember, is not just ships. Trucks and truck queuing is a really, really significant source of truck emissions in the South Coast Air Basin up at the Port of Oakland. We do not have trucks queuing at our front gate. We get a few backups when you get it after the lunch hour. When folks are coming back in, you will get a few trucks lined up, but it's not a consistent or significant problem for us at all, because we very intentionally are trying to structure the operations around avoiding any type of queuing like that. So that's a critical piece to it. I was going to, if folks are interested, I was trying to explain to a group of students a few weeks ago what the supply chain bottleneck is. And so in my Michelangelo-like freehand, I drew a diagram of the supply chain that I could throw up if that is cool with Brian and Joe and Laki to sort of just put a finger on what's happening.
Sure. Do we want to?
I gave you permission to screen.
Excellent. Thank you.
All right. Thank you. All right. Can everybody see this beautiful
Yes.
hand drawn drawing here?
Is it by you or by your daughter?
The
drawing.
This was actually my drawing on a.
Okay.
There we go. So essentially, this is the basics of the supply chain. This is 101. You have a ship here that brings in stuff. That stuff is typically in a container. And that ship comes into a port, berths at a berth location, and a piece of equipment lifts that container off and puts it onto a thing called a chassis. And a chassis is basically like a giant metal skateboard with really big rubber tires on it. You then have a port truck that drives the chassis carrying the container somewhere else onto the port and drops it off. That port truck then goes back and does it again and gets another one. It never leaves the port. A little bit later, a separate truck drives onto the port. This one here, this is a Class 8 truck, and it picks up the container and the chassis, and it drives it off the port. It takes it typically to a warehouse. Now, all of this happens at Hueneme within a day, or maybe at the most 2 days. This is just sort of dwell time and turnaround time. Other port facilities, this can take more than a week, well more than a week, where the containers can be sitting, stacking up. When that truck leaves, that warehouse can be anywhere from a mile to several hundred miles, depending. And this is called drayage trucking. So when you hear about drayage trucks, they're referring to exactly this model. From that warehouse, a whole bunch of different things can happen. The goods can get offloaded and put onto a different truck and taken somewhere else. They can get put on a train. They can get simply a few things can get taken out, and then they can go straight to a store. So this is kind of that's where you get that dissemination of stuff happening. The train, the truck, all of this goes to maybe a distribution center. We have built a tremendous number of those in the last 10 years in California and in the West. These are the famous Amazon warehouses. These are these huge behemoth warehouses in the Inland Empire. From those distribution centers, they usually will go either on another truck or on a box truck to your house. Or from the store, you go there, you buy it, and it goes to your house that way. This is basically how most of the system works. And this goes all the way from the West Coast or the East Coast, all the way into the middle of the country. And we have to remember there's also airplanes involved in this too, if you're ordering something with enough sort of priority that you need to pay all that extra money to get a plane involved. Right now, a lot of the supply chain problems are over here on this side. They are these chassis, the skateboard with wheels. There is a significant shortage of those in a lot of locations. There just simply aren't enough of them. And there's also problems getting containers. And critically, there are problems in getting truck drivers, because we have to acknowledge in this whole thing that workers are a critical part of this whole process. And right now, a really important piece of this that we have to remember that's being driven by these is this consumption, right? COVID obviously has pushed all of us into this mode of I want it now, I'm gonna buy it, I need it here. I buy it on my phone, and what happens? This whole thing begins to drive and move and work to deliver that thing to your doorstep way over here, your house over here, your house down here, via these trucks. This whole system, right? This whole system right now is built around one thing, and that's cost. And cost drives that whole food chain. And right now, all of those externalities, the pollution, and that pollution isn't just happening in Oxnard or Oakland or Carson or West Long Beach. It's happening in Bangladesh. It's happening in Brazil. It's happening in South Africa. It's happening in Europe. It's happening everywhere because diesel is the common language of goods movement the world over. And that's just how it is. But when you do that, when you buy these things and drive this system, all of that pollution gets just sort of put by the wayside to fall on those communities that historically live in port adjacent locations that have the least ability, the least resources, the least access to the political levers to change this system and to drive change into how this model works.
Got it. Got it. That's
It's
very
just the reality of how our economy works. But the really cool thing is that this is now beginning to change. And companies like Wallenius that Andrew's here talking about are one of the leaders in that change. And places like Hueneme are places where that change is also beginning to happen.
Mhm.
And that is kind of one of the main messages I just want to share tonight. It's like, you know, we hear a lot about the politicization of some of this green energy stuff. And I don't want to get into politics necessarily, but it's unavoidable when we're talking about this subject. Because the reality is that this transition away from fossil fuels is the right thing for not only the planet, but also people in the immediate term. You know, that shortage of truck drivers is largely because the wages and the conditions in which those people are working are totally inequitable. And this system has to change to accommodate for that. And granted, we can't, you know, disrupt and destroy the entire system in the process of change. We have to work within the system as it's constructed to keep people fed, keep people getting the goods and services that they need, and keep people employed. But we need to drive change. That is undeniable. And it's places and companies like these that are really beginning to say, well, we are not going to structure this on cost alone anymore. We are going to integrate a price for carbon, a price for air quality pollution into our daily operations of doing business, into our bottom line. And that is revolutionary right now and really not being done in a whole lot of places. And it's happening in California as a reflection of rules from the Air Resources Board, expectations from the community, and commitments from companies like Wallenius. So, sorry, I get passionate about this subject because it's really, really critical that the average person who's using their phone to buy stuff sees their part in this much bigger ecosystem.
Yeah. Actually, we have a question from our legendary legislator from Pavli, and it's a curiosity question. She was asking, we've got, Amazon has built, a pretty sizable warehouse in Oxnard, and she was wondering if the goods that go into that warehouse, they originate from Port of Hueneme, or do they come from Port of LA and Long Beach?
Yeah, almost all of that stuff that's going through that facility are coming from Long Beach and LA. We get very few consumer goods. In fact, I can't think that we actually ever get any. We're bananas and fruit, and then automobiles and things like transformers and piping and high and heavy stuff.
Right. Okay. Very good. Fantastic. So we started alluding to that transition and transformation to the cleaner technologies. And obviously, from the environmental perspective, we may all have our biases, would have loved to have transitioned to zero emissions operations, whether they're battery electric type of zero emission technology, or whether it's a hydrogen based technology. And we know the application exists, as Andrew was saying, for certain equipment, certain vessels, certain vehicles. but not yet for others, especially those in the heavy duty cycle type of business. We know that they're around the corner. Give it a little more time and the technology will adapt itself. But the reality is, as Andrew was saying, even if I have a pot of money and when I invest it right now, I want to buy that gigantic, perhaps forklift, the 40,000. I can't remember now the tonnage that you were referring to. It's not technologically feasible. It may be, in a few years, but now it's not. So given the state of our environment, from local smog, climate change, environmental justice, we have this zero emission path strategy. On the other hand, the conventional strategies, they're becoming near zero. For instance, yes, we want to divorce ourselves from diesel, but you've got natural gas-based trucking, which is quite controversial, actually, in Long Beach and LA. But they do offer sizable emission reductions very quickly. They help you get out of diesel completely, so you don't have the diesel exposure. They're not as sexy as the zero emission all electrical hydrogen technologies. But do you see, why would it be the smart? Looking at your crystal ball, and maybe it's not unfair what I'm asking, but just using your imagination, looking 5, 10, 15 years from now, do you see us going 100% electric all zero? Or do you feel there'll be some combination of near zero and zero? What is that optimal balance that, from your perspective, what is that balance that you see?
Andrew, do you want to?
And there's no right or wrong answer, right? We are using our imaginations at this juncture.
So I think one of the biggest key components to keep an eye on with this is, where does the energy production come from? And are we talking about like scope 1 emissions or scope 2 emissions? So we're talking about the overall supply chain and how vehicles move and how equipment moves and like the process that we're involved in. One of the biggest things that I'm working towards is moving from scope 1 emissions of burned fuels to scope 2 emissions of purchased electricity. So yes, I do see a much cleaner future within the next 5 to 10 years, as you alluded to, because the technology is coming there and the OEMs are coming up with the products and it will be available to buy. And it's keeping those conversations alive with the energy providers as well too. So now that we've went from burning scope 1 emissions of diesel to now purchasing electricity of scope 2 emissions, having that conversation with the energy providers like LADWP, like SoCal Edison, to make sure that now we haven't just passed the buck somewhere else. Now that they're also doing their part to make sure that the power generation of this electricity is also clean as well.
Sure. Mm-hmm. So from your vantage point, you see a much clearer path towards zero, all zero, provided there is an adequate time frame to allow you to do the transition, and assuming the utilities will also do their part and bring the power supply, which we all hope society-wise, that is being produced, it's a cleanly produced electricity or hydrogen.
From our perspective, as long as the equipment's out there, we're willing to purchase the equipment and make the necessary investments to clean up our piece of the supply chain. The problem is it just pushes the buck to someone else. So now if we're buying electricity versus buying diesel to really truly clean up the supply chain, that's when we have to get like SoCal Edison and LADWP to do their portion of it as well.
Got it. Very good. Giles?
Yeah, no, thank you, Laki. I think I really appreciate Andrew's answer. I think it's really important to remember the ultimate source from which those fuels come, even renewables. Exactly to his point, if the carbon intensity of the grid is higher than a certain point, well, if you, for instance, if you charge a Tesla in the Dakotas, that's 100% coal power that is charging your Tesla that you're driving. So we are blessed with having, we're not quite the Pacific Northwest, but we have a very, very low carbon intensity grid in California. but we have major issues with the supply side. You know what? I really encourage anybody watching this webinar, the California Independent System Operator. This is the government entity that basically manages the California electrical grid. They have a super cool app for your phone that you can go on and look at real-time information about not only renewables, but the amount of renewables in the power supply at that very moment of the day. And what you will see is a fascinating story around renewable energy use and generation in the state of California. And what it shows is that at night, we're still heavily reliant on fossil fuels as a state.
Mhm.
Little tiny bit of nuclear in there and a little tiny bit of coal sometimes. But during the day, we have a overabundance of solar and other renewables. So for us at the port, to more directly answer your question, we do not see a future with clean versions of fossil fuels as being a stepping stone, an interim, a bridge, whatever euphemism you want to use. We are really looking at this opportunity. Now, the critical thing we have to remember is that the port does not own any of this equipment. We don't own the ships, we don't own the trucks, we don't own the cranes, we don't own the forklifts. Our partners are the the equipment owners. We own the infrastructure side and the land. So for us, this is not us able to do this alone. That is why our relationships with Wallenius's and Glovis's and all of the companies that make this place work are essential. But what our outlook on this is that we want to ensure that we are doing right by facilitating not only customer success of moving cargo, but doing it in a carbon-free, pollution-free way in the future. To get to that end, a really important piece to this question, and something that we get asked at the port, is, we're a public agency. We're a state special district, so we have to be sort of, very intentional about how we answer questions and how we do things and how we use public funding. For us, doing this right and investing the public resources that we have is really, really a very serious responsibility for us. So looking at infrastructure, looking at the state of the technology is a really critical piece of planning for this future. What we are doing to address this question, we got a grant from the California Energy Commission just this year to essentially help us to do a bunch of planning specifically around what a future decarbonized port would look like. What is the timeline? What is the cost? What's the amount of fuel? And how long will it take? Because there's lots of different options out there. There's battery electric, as you alluded to. There's potentially green hydrogen. There's potentially ammonia. Those
10 seconds, Giles.
Oh, so, it's something that we want to get correct and that we're now working on such that we can answer that, but we're not looking at fossil fuel futures.
Got it. And we are collaborating on that project as well, both as the coalition, Breathe LA. So we have a good partnership going on that. Ladies and gentlemen, time flies when you're having fun. So we reached the last 5 minutes allotted to the webinar. And should I be turning it over to you, back to you, Joe or Brian? And Joe, I'm sorry, do I have time to ask your question?
No, it's okay. I'll ask it.
Okay.
I'll ask it of Giles
All
some
right.
other time. But yeah, actually, we're going to turn it over to Chris to talk about Coalition for Clean Air for a minute. Thank you, Laki and Giles and Andrew. But let's hear from Chris a little bit about what Coalition for Clean Air is up to.
Yeah, so this is Chris Chavez. I'm the Deputy Policy Director at Coalition for Clean Air, and pleasure to seeing everybody, my old boss, Senator Pavley. And actually, it's nice to be talking to Ventura County folks. When I used to work for Senator Pavley, obviously, Ventura County was near and dear to our hearts. And actually, my sister and brother-in-law both live and work in Ventura County. One's a school bus driver, and I actually just posted about how they have their first electric school bus at their district. So that's great. And I know my brother-in-law works at the Ventura Harbor District. So great to see some friendly faces here.
Did they buy through funding from Ventura County PCD?
Yes, I hope so. I don't know all the details, but it's still great to.
I bet it is.
So yes, 2021 was a real eventful year for air quality. We have actually later this week some new rules coming to regarding the maintenance and inspection of heavy duty trucks. We had two major rules passed at the South Coast AQMD, one of which relating to warehouses. Changes in the San Joaquin Valley relating to agricultural burning, as well as a new CARB regulation to transition us away from gasoline-powered small off-road engines. And we saw a massive amount of investment in clean transportation and getting us away from harmful emissions from traffic capacity expansion projects. But a lot of work remains. California is still home to the dirtiest air in the nation, and multiple air basins are on track to fail meeting national and state air quality standards. And sadly, most of that burden falls on low-income communities and communities of color. So looking ahead to 2022, our priorities include following up on last year's massive investments in clean transportation with additional funding that prioritize equity, both including in terms of vehicles and charging infrastructure. We also are continuing with the reauthorization of AB 8, which affects many of California's transportation funding streams. We also want to see a state implementation plan that puts California on course to having healthy air and having air quality that meets those federal and state standards. Lastly, we're also looking at continuing the work to drastically cutting pollution from cars, trucks, and locomotives. This includes the upcoming Clean Cars rule at CARB, as well as working to reduce emissions from the goods movement corridor, whether that's at the ports, all the way up to the warehouses and the rail yards, and really working to get that cleaner technology that we have now, as well as cleaner technology that we'll have in the future deployed and ready for prime time. So we have a lot of work ahead. We are constantly pushing at the legislature, constantly pushing at the air quality management districts and air pollution control districts at CARB, and working with our local partners too, whether those are CBOs, cities, special government districts, and really carrying forward and pushing to protect public health, improve air quality, and prevent climate change.
That's fantastic.
Thanks, Chris. Brian, are you around?
Well, that was an amazing panel. I think many of you on this webinar are going to have or will be receiving, an invitation to participate in that blueprint, Port of Hueneme electric blueprint. So look for that. We're looking forward to working with many of you. It is really exciting, Giles, and if you didn't see the chat, Giles, I noted that you don't need super fancy graphics to get your point across. So that's my big takeaway today. If you enjoyed this clean air conversation, could you do me a favor and just in the reaction button on your bottom right corner, if you could just click it and give me the little thumbs up, then I'll know for sure and we'll record it. So Andrew, that's good. Oh, great. Good, Charles. All right, look at I'm looking at that's telling me also that people, and I got a little celebratory thing. So that's really great. The Coalition for Clean Air, we're celebrating our 50th anniversary. And as such, we are encouraging all of you. And I know there's many of you from our other, nonprofits. So good news. It's only $19.71. We were founded in 1971. So, think about it. It's a great, you can give it as a gift to somebody. But yeah, I'm just really excited that everybody was able to be here. And, we've got another conversation coming up. I don't know, Joe, if you wanted to describe what vapor intrusion is before you leave, but I'm not going to try. But it is basically, I think for a lot of folks in environmental justice communities, they ought to be really interested in it, and it'll be December 16th. With that, I'll hand it back over to Joe, and please ccair.org/donate.
Yes, ccair.org/donate. So please, support our other nonprofits here too, who are our partners. That we're working with all of them in one way, shape, or form, and really appreciate the partnerships we formed with Frog and with Breathe SoCal and others, and if I forget anybody, forgive me. We have come to 6 o'clock, past 6 o'clock actually, so we're gonna wrap it up. Vapor intrusion is when contamination gets in the soil, vapors underneath something, and then comes up and ends up in your house, your work, or you're breathing it in one way, shape, or form. It's been a big issue, difficult to model and measure and deal with. But when they look at the kind of health impacts that are associated with vapor intrusion, it becomes a big problem for people trying to clean it up, people trying to live in those communities, and for the people who created the pollution in the first place. That all said and done, I'd like to thank Karen Volp-Gardella and Brian Sheridan and Chris Chavez, our staff members at Coalition for Clean Air, that helped make this event possible today. And thank you again to the Port of Hueneme for sponsoring this event. We very much appreciate it. I'm going to sign off and say what I say every time: may every breath you take be a breath of clean air, which is a little complicated right now in Ventura if you look at our low-cost air quality sensor network. But maybe it'll be better tomorrow, Laki, right?
I'm optimistic. Yes, it will be.
Keep working on it. Thank you, everyone. Good to see you guys. And thanks for the commitment to doing all that great work at the Port of Hueneme.
And thank you to
Thanks,
the coalition.
everyone.